All right, so in our last topic of Unit 1, we discussed maps and we learned about the types of maps, what's wrong with maps, and the kind of information that you can find on maps. And so, our next two topics that we're going to cover together, topics 2 and 3, are going to talk about how geographers even get that information to put it on the maps. And they can't just grab it out of thin air, it has to come from somewhere. And so, by the end of this lesson, you should be able to identify different methods of geographic data collection. Sorry. And explain the geographic data collection decisions made using geographic information. That's really fancy words for just saying you should be able to tell me how geographers collect the data and how that data is used and why it's important. So, geographic data is collected one of two ways, either through fieldwork or field observations or geospatial technologies, and we're going to look at both of those in more detail. So, fieldwork is the act of an individual physically visiting a location or place and recording firsthand information there. So, they're not looking it up online to gather information or using any form of GPS or GIS, which we'll talk about in a second. They're getting their information from people. And so, an example of this, and something that's actually currently happening, is the US Census. And so, if you're unfamiliar, the US Census is a nationwide population count every 10 years. And it's not just like how many people live in the United States, it's how many people live here and where they live. And so that's important because it determines, which state get the most representation in Congress. It determines where government funding goes. The money is going to go to where more people live. And it's going to determine personal decision making for you and for me, government decision making, and business decision making. I find it funny. I'm from a super small town, even smaller than Ruston. And like growing up, everyone's always complaining, there's nothing to do here. There's nothing to do here. Like we didn't even have any fast food restaurants. And it's just hard to explain to people that when your town only has 2,000 people in it, like McDonald's isn't like jumping to get there and put a business because there's going to be no money there for them. And so collecting this type of data affects business decision making. That's just one example of field work or field observations. More techniques can be found over here, and you're welcome to pause this video and look at that. But the main thing you need to know is that field work or field observations is getting the data from people. And I know that some of you might be like, well, we filled out our census online. I did too. But they're still getting that information from people. And used to, that's personally was how they did the US Census. They would knock on your door and they would say, hey, can you fill out this piece of paper? And still today, if your family doesn't fill it out online, the government will send someone to your door and be like, hey, you need to fill out the census because an accurate count is that important. So field work or field observations, getting the data from people, which is different from geospatial technologies, which is the second way that geographers gather data. Geospatial technologies are the range of modern tools contributing to the geographic mapping and analysis of the Earth and human societies. We're going to talk about three different geospatial technologies: GIS, GPS, and remote sensing. So, GIS is a computer system that stores, analyzes, and displays information from multiple digital maps or data sets. There is a cool illustration over here for you to follow, but what GIS does is it takes all of the data and it puts it in layers so that we can find patterns. So an example of this would be if they took like a blank layout of Louisiana They added a road map, and then on top of that, they added like the cases of coronavirus. Well, you would be able to see, well, coronavirus spread through the major interstates. That's how people were traveling. So that's how it spread from New Orleans, where the hotspot was, all across the state. That's just one example. Another example that it could be used for is, it says on here, the analysis of crime data. So again, they can take a blank map of the United States, maybe put like a map of the residential areas on top of that, and then put crime data on top of that. And so they can see, okay, well, in this area of the state, in this neighborhood, um, there's a lot of criminal activity, but there's not so much over here. Just random stuff like that. And what it does is it allows you to just compare um, and find patterns, and it allows better analysis of information. Another geospatial technology that is used, and one that you're probably most familiar with, is GPS, or Global Positioning System, or it's sometimes also called satellite navigation systems. And GPS is a system of satellites orbiting the Earth and communicating locational information to GPS receivers. So GPS is a bunch of satellites up in space, and it's sending information to GPS receivers. This is a GPS receiver, right? It's not a GPS. So satellites are sending information to my phone about my exact location, right? So my phone doesn't know I'm right here, but the GPS does, and it's sending it to my phone saying this is where she is. Okay? So some people get confused. They think this is a GPS. It's not. It's a GPS receiver. Um, you use GPS probably every day, either through your phone, or if you post a picture on Instagram and tag your location, you're using GPS. It's just sending information to receivers about absolute location. Okay, and so it's used for finding absolute location and for navigation. The last geospatial technology we're going to talk about is remote sensing. And remote sensing is just the use of cameras or other sensors mounted on aircraft or satellites to collect images of Earth's surface. This is used for determining land use. So, are people using this land for farming? Are they building businesses on it? Is it a residential area? And a lot of that you can't really see until like you get a picture from space. It's also used for monitoring environmental changes, and that's what this example is over here to the right. This is a piece of land before and after a tsunami, which a tsunami is an earthquake that happens in the ocean, and it produces giant waves that destroy anything in its path. And so you can see down here was before the tsunami. It looks like a pretty active place, lots of vegetation, lots of buildings. After the tsunami, they can see the devastation of this place and how vast the damage actually is. Another way you may have seen it used in monitoring environmental changes is when you see those pictures or videos, or like time-lapse videos of the polar caps melting, like how they used to be super big and they've gotten smaller over time. That's remote sensing. And monitoring the weather. So they can track weather patterns using remote sensing as well. So, just a quick overview, 2 ways that geographers collect data, either through fieldwork or geospatial technologies. And the 3 geospatial technologies are GIS, GPS, and remote sensing. So make sure you answer the questions below the video and let me know if you have any questions.